It wasn't Harry Truman who decided America would fight the Cold War. It wasn't Congress. It wasn't the American people who were never asked. It was an undersecretary of state, a lawyer's son, a man famous mostly for his mustache, standing in a White House meeting room on a February afternoon, telling the most powerful men in the country that the world hadn't seen a divide like this since Rome and Carthage. 10 minutes later, they believed him. That man was Dean Acheson, and the meeting he dominated wasn't supposed to be his to run. By February of 1947, Britain had just told Washington, in a 2-page note, that it could no longer afford to hold up its half of the world. Not the war. Greece. A civil war was tearing the country apart, and Britain, the empire that had run the seas for a century, was giving notice. It couldn't pay anymore. Turkey was next. Squeezed by Soviet demands for military bases on the Bosphorus, somebody had to answer, and fast. The man who walked into that White House meeting to answer wasn't the president. He wasn't elected to anything. He was the second-ranking official in the State Department. And when Truman spoke first and the room stayed cold, it was Acheson who stood up and took over. He didn't talk about Greece as a country. He talked about it as a body. Greece, he told them, was a semi-conscious patient on the critical list whose relatives and physicians had been discussing whether his life could be saved. He said the corruption spreading from it would work like apples in a barrel infected by a rotten one. It would infect Iran and everything east of it, then Africa through Asia Minor and Egypt, then Europe through Italy and France. He said the world hadn't seen a polarization of power like this since Athens and Sparta, not since Rome and Carthage. Then he stopped. There was a long silence. And then Michigan's Arthur Vandenberg, a Republican, an isolationist by instinct, a man who had spent a decade insisting America's business stopped at its own coastline, said the sentence that ended American isolationism. Mr. President, if you will say that to the Congress and the country, I will support you. Acheson's own verdict on that afternoon was blunter. I knew, he said, we were met at Armageddon. One man drew the lines. The world has lived inside them ever since. This is not the story you've been told about how the Cold War began. It's usually told as Truman's story, a president, a speech, a line drawn against communism. That story isn't wrong. It's incomplete. The line was drawn by an advisor nobody elected, in a room most Americans never heard about, and the architecture he built that afternoon would still be running the world 25 years after he left office. This is the hidden chapter, not the president who announced the Cold War, but the man who designed it, and who by the end of his life would sit across from a different president and tell him the whole machine had gone wrong. To understand how one unelected man got that kind of power, you have to understand how frightened America actually was in 1946. The country that would soon call itself the leader of the free world had just demobilized its army from 12 million men to under 2 million in about a year, the fastest, largest disarmament in the country's history, done not out of strategy, but out of exhaustion. Jobs were scarce. Housing was scarce. Strikes rolled through the shipyards of the West Coast and the steel mills of the Great Lakes, as workers who'd spent the war being told to wait now found the peace wasn't paying them back either. Racial tensions, suppressed for 4 years by the demands of total war, broke back into the open across the South. Millions of veterans came home with nothing processed and nowhere to put it. This wasn't a triumphant superpower flexing new muscle. It was a nervous country, still rationing its confidence, being asked to run the world it had just finished saving. That nervousness would soon curdle into something closer to paranoia. Beginning that March, the federal government launched a loyalty program to screen its own employees for communist sympathy. Over the following years, millions of personnel files would pass under review, and thousands of federal workers would lose their jobs on suspicion alone, no trial, often no specific charge, just a file and a doubt. This is the emotional weather the entire architecture was built in. A country that had just won the largest war in human history, and still couldn't shake the feeling that the enemy might already be inside the building. Across the ocean, the empire that had run that world for 2 centuries was quietly falling apart. In March of 1946, Winston Churchill stood in Fulton, Missouri, and gave the divide a name, an Iron Curtain. And for the first time, 2 wartime allies were talking about each other in public like enemies. Britain, meanwhile, was trying to hold 3 collapsing fronts at once. Greece, where civil war raged, Turkey, where the Soviets wanted transit rights through the Bosphorus, and its own economy, which the war had gutted. British estimates put the cost of saving Greece alone somewhere between $240 and $280 million, money London simply didn't have. And in Moscow, the fear ran an exact mirror image. That same year, Soviet Ambassador Nikolai Novikov sent his own government a telegram arguing that American foreign policy, reflecting the imperialistic tendency of American monopoly capital, had been characterized in the post-war period by a desire for world domination. 2 capitals, Each convinced the other was plotting to bury it. Both, in a sense, were right about the shape of what was coming, even if neither had the motive quite correct. Into this room of nervous men walked a small caste who would decide what happened next. Harry Truman kept a sign on his desk that read, "The buck stops here," sent to him by a federal reformatory in Oklahoma in October of 1945. And Acheson later said of him that Truman could and did outwork us all, with no need for papers pre-digested into one-page pellets of pablum. Truman himself said he'd insisted on the harder language in his own doctrine speech, because I wanted no hedging in this speech. It had to be clear and free of hesitation or double talk. But Truman also knew his limits in a room full of policy experts, which is exactly why, on February 27, 1947, it wasn't Truman's voice that changed the trajectory of the meeting. George Marshall, the Secretary of State, was a man of such rigid self-effacement that Acheson, his own deputy, once had to lean over and whisper, "General, is it all right if I speak?" before addressing the room himself. Marshall trusted Acheson to make the emotional case precisely because Marshall wouldn't make it himself. He was a soldier's soldier, precise, silent, allergic to theater, and the fact that a man like that let Acheson do the talking tells you something about how badly the moment needed someone who wasn't afraid of grand claims. Arthur Vandenberg, the Michigan Republican who converted an entire party's foreign policy with a single sentence, gave the plan its bipartisan cover in Congress. Not everyone signed on. Ohio's Robert Taft warned that what Truman was proposing was a complete departure from previous American policy, an acceptance of the philosophy of force as the controlling factor in international relations. He was overruled, and the moment passed almost without notice, which is its own kind of lesson. Dissent doesn't have to be loud to be right, and it doesn't have to be right to be ignored. And in Moscow, George Kennan, a poet as much as a diplomat, had already sent an 8,000-word telegram back to Washington the year before, arguing that the Kremlin's aggression came from a traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity, not simple ambition. Kennan gave the containment strategy its intellectual skeleton. Acheson would give it a body, a voice, and the political will to move. Now this is the part most retellings skip. The architecture didn't stop at Greece and Turkey. It escalated in 6 distinct moves over the next 3 years, each one bigger than the last, and each one built and defended by the same small circle of men. First, the abdication itself, and everything it dragged in behind it. Britain's note arrived in February. By March 12th, Truman stood before Congress and asked for $400 million, nearly $7 billion in today's money, to save 2 countries most Americans couldn't find on a map. It passed with a standing ovation. Only Taft's voice broke the applause, and it changed nothing. The vote that would govern the next 40 years of American foreign policy was decided in one afternoon by men most voters had never heard speak, and it didn't stop with money. Weeks later, the National Security Act of 1947 quietly created the CIA, the National Security Council, and a unified Department of Defense, the permanent machinery of a national security state assembled with almost no public debate at all, in the same season as the loyalty screening program that was already combing through millions of federal employee files. In the space of a few months, America built the apparatus to fight a war it hadn't officially entered, and the apparatus to police its own citizens for disloyalty to a cause most of them didn't yet know had a name. Second, the Marshall Plan, and the airlift it eventually forced. In June of 1947, Marshall stood at Harvard's commencement and in 11 quiet minutes announced what would become the largest peacetime transfer of wealth in history. It was logical, he said, that the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. More than $13 billion, something like $160 billion today, roughly $1 in every 20 of the entire American economy, was shipped across an ocean to rebuild the continent that had just tried to destroy itself twice in 30 years. Joseph Jones, the State Department speechwriter who helped sell it to the country, called it America being handed the job of world leadership, with all its burdens and all its glory. Stalin refused to let Eastern Europe participate, and by the following summer, Soviet troops had sealed every road, rail line, and canal into West Berlin. For 11 straight months, American and British planes flew coal and flour over Soviet checkpoints in a continuous relay, sometimes landing a plane every 90 seconds, to keep 2 million people fed and warm through a European winter without firing a single shot. The humanitarian plan had become the line that split a continent in two, and then split it again in the air over a blockaded city. Third, NATO, and the bomb that immediately made it obsolete as a guarantee of safety. In April of 1949, 12 nations signed a treaty promising that an attack on one was an attack on all, A mutual defense pact so far-reaching that no legislature anywhere debated it in the terms it would eventually be used. 4 months later, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, years ahead of anyone's prediction, and the American nuclear monopoly, the one advantage the entire architecture had been quietly built around, simply ended. Novelist William Faulkner, accepting his Nobel Prize that same season, told the audience there was now only the question, when will I be blown up? It wasn't literary exaggeration, it was the honest mood of the year, spoken by a man who had no reason to perform alarm. Fourth, China, and the four-word accusation that outlived every fact in the document meant to answer it. That same August, the State Department published a white paper on the fall of China to Mao's forces, a document running past 1,000 pages, meant to explain what had happened and who was responsible. It explained nothing to its critics. In October, Mao proclaimed the People's Republic from Tiananmen, and Republicans in Congress began asking the question that would follow Acheson for the rest of his career: who lost China? Nobody in his own department had lost anything they controlled. China had never been Washington's to keep, any more than a house fire is the neighbor's to prevent. It didn't matter. The accusation stuck to him personally, and it never let go. Let that settle for a moment. 1,000 pages of documented fact, up against 4 words of accusation, and the 4 words won. Fifth, and this is the moment the whole architecture nearly turned on its own architect. On January 12, 1950, Acheson stood at the National Press Club and described America's defensive perimeter in Asia, a line, he said, that runs along the Aleutians to Japan and then goes to the Ryukyus, continuing down to the Philippines. Asia, he told the room, had entered a new day, and its peoples were on their own, and know it, and intend to continue on their own. South Korea was not on the line. 164 days later, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. Historians still argue over how much weight to put on that omission. What isn't in dispute is the cost. American forces pushed back to a shrinking perimeter around Busan, then landing at Incheon that September in one of the boldest amphibious gambles in military history, then driving north almost to the Chinese border, before hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River that November and turned the retreat from the Chosin Reservoir into what survivors simply called a frozen hell. More than 36,000 Americans died. Millions of Koreans died. One grieving mother wrote to Acheson directly and told him, in her own words, that he was the murderer of her son. The map he'd drawn alone, at his own desk, had become in the public mind an invitation. Sixth, Hiss, and the sentence that made a loyal man look like a traitor. Weeks before Korea, Alger Hiss, a former State Department official and Acheson's own friend, was convicted of perjury in a case that convinced much of the country he'd spied for the Soviets. On January 25, 1950, at a press conference, Acheson was asked whether he'd disown him. He answered in 13 words, "I do not intend to turn my back on Alger Hiss." He meant it as loyalty. The country heard it as guilt. Within weeks he was being burned in effigy and branded Red Dean in the press. A junior senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy waved a piece of paper in Wheeling, West Virginia, claiming 205 communists worked inside the very department Acheson ran. He accused Acheson and Marshall together of belonging to a conspiracy so immense as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. The architect of the Cold War had become its most convenient villain, blamed, in the same season, for both losing a country he never controlled and defending a friend the country had already convicted in its own mind. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to tell this as a simple story of one brilliant man against a mob of conspiracy theorists, and that isn't quite right either. Acheson was not an innocent bystander to the fear he helped create. The loyalty program, the language of infection and rot, the framing of every regional conflict as a single global test, these were his tools before they were McCarthy's. He built a machine designed to move a frightened country toward confrontation, and it worked exactly as intended, right up until the fear he'd stoked turned around and pointed at him personally. That isn't a contradiction in the story, it's the story. By 1951, on paper, the machine worked exactly as designed. American troops and their allies pushed back the North Korean invasion. Truman, asserting civilian control of the military, in a decision Acheson backed completely, fired General MacArthur that April, rather than let a general dictate foreign policy to elected government, a decision so unpopular it triggered the largest wave of public anger of Truman's presidency, and one Acheson never publicly regretted. A 58-page classified memo called NSC-68, drafted by Acheson's own protege, Paul Mitzi, in about 2 months, and warning of a struggle involving the fulfillment or destruction not only of this republic, but of civilization itself, was formally adopted. Defense spending nearly tripled, from about 5% of the American economy to over 14% inside 3 years. Call it the most expensive memo in history, 58 pages that quietly redirected $1 in every 7 the country earned for a generation without a single public vote on the document itself. Containment, the strategy Kennan had sketched and Acheson had built into policy, was now permanent, institutional, bipartisan, and, for all practical purposes, irreversible. In January of 1953, Acheson walked out of the State Department for the last time, with the architecture he'd built still standing exactly as he'd left it. That should be where the story ends. It isn't. The machine he built didn't retire when he did. In October of 1962, a private citizen named Dean Acheson was called back to Washington and put on the small committee advising a different president through the Cuban Missile Crisis, the exact kind of nuclear brinkmanship his own containment doctrine had helped make possible. He was sent to Paris to inform Charles de Gaulle, not consult him, about the American decision. De Gaulle reportedly asked whether Acheson was there to inform him or to consult him. Acheson's answer was simple. He was there to inform him of the president's decision. 2 months later, at West Point, Acheson delivered the line that would outlive almost everything else he ever said. Great Britain has lost an empire and has not yet found a role. The architect of American power, diagnosing the decline of the very empire whose collapse had put that power in his hands in the first place. And then, in March of 1968, the machine turned all the way back on him. Called in by Lyndon Johnson as one of the so-called wise men to advise on Vietnam, a war built on the exact containment logic Acheson had spent his career installing, Acheson told the president plainly that the war was not winnable. He told him the military had no real plan to win it. He told him it was destroying the country for nothing. Days later, on March 31st, Johnson went on national television and announced he would not seek re-election, and began scaling back the war he had spent 3 years escalating. The man who built the machine that made Vietnam possible was the same man who told a president how to start dismantling it. He died in 1971, at his desk, among his own papers. 4 years later, in 1975, NSC 68, the 58-page memo that had tripled America's defense budget without a single public vote, was finally declassified, and the country got its first real look at the document that had quietly run its foreign policy for a quarter century. The architecture he built outlasted him by decades, and pieces of it are still standing. Permanent alliances that were never meant to be permanent, a defense budget that has never returned to where it stood before 1950, an intelligence and national security apparatus assembled in a few unwatched months in 1947 that grew and never really stopped. We rarely think about the Cold War as something that was built. We think of it as something that happened. A weather system, a historical inevitability, two superpowers colliding because that's what superpowers do. It wasn't inevitable. It was designed, in specific rooms, on specific afternoons, mostly by men nobody elected. One sentence, "I do not intend to turn my back," nearly ended a career. One map, with a gap in it, helped start a war. One memo, 58 pages, secret for 25 years, tripled a nation's arsenal. One man drew the lines. The world has lived inside them ever since. If you've ever wondered why American foreign policy runs on permanent alliances, permanent defense spending, and the assumption that someone else's civil war is automatically our business, you've been living inside Dean Acheson's answer to a 2-page British note. Not since Rome and Carthage, he said, had the world seen power divide this way. He wasn't just describing the moment, he was building the machine that would keep dividing it, decade after decade, long after the man who designed it was gone. If this kind of hidden architecture history is what you come here for, the next chapter is already waiting. The quiet, decades-long feud between the poet who invented containment and the number cruncher who priced it, Kennan against Nietzsche, and how two men who never agreed on anything ended up building the same war from opposite directions.